All right, boys and girls, welcome once again to the Bass Kayak and Beers podcast and the Paddle and Fin Network. Let's see, rundown of my week before we actually diving into this episode. Cold weather here in Texas. It's been kind of like weekends get cold, weeks get warm, and then it gets cold again. So it's been kind of up and down. We go from the 40 degrees to mid 30s to 80 degrees, and 2 days later we go back to freezing weather. So it's been kind of an interesting bipolar winter, which is usually is here in Texas on February. But a lot of great tournaments took place. A lot of great tournaments coming up. Broken Bow, first day of Broken Bow registration, and I think it's going to be sold out in less than 24 hours. That's great for Hobie BOS. Glad to see the tournaments are growing. Speaking of tournaments, we're going to be talking about tournaments and fishing up in the Pacific Northwest. Marvin Forte is going to be my guest for the day, and I really like the Pacific Northwest area. Although I've never been there, I have friends that have moved there, and I've always find it interesting, and I really gravitated to that side of the country, and it's in my bucket list to go visit. Quick story: I almost moved from Puerto Rico to Seattle on a job for what was called Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS, before it became Homeland Security. And I was going to be stationed in Seattle and in that area. It was a great job opportunity, but that's when they started merging kind of like the Homeland Security shortly after 9/11 and change in administration in the White House. So paperwork kept getting pushed back. When they finally told me they had a position, I had moved on to other things. So I never got to move to that area. But I did a lot of research on that area when I was going to move, and I was really excited to move to that area of the United States. But anyways, I digress. I'm going to bring in my next guest, and we're going to be talking about fishing, tournament fishing, and fun fishing up in the Oregon area. And again, Marvin Forte, he is a tournament director in that area. We're going to be talking about Idaho too. So a lot of great places over there that I think don't get the love that they should when it comes to bass fishing. But before we go into my next guest, quick shout out once again to my sponsor, Douglas Rod. Go to douglasoutdoors.com. Check out their full lineup of LRS, graphite rods, X Matrix rods, and award-winning fly fishing rods. So go check them out. We'll go to a quick promotion for waypoints, and then we'll bring in Marvin Forte. Marvin Forte. Forte, is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yes, that works. Good.
I forgot to ask you before we started the recording, so I was like, I hope I'm getting it right. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Pretty good, man. Honored to have you on the podcast. I was talking to Dan Perry about bringing in a guest, and I wanted to touch on different areas, not just stay with Texas fishing and all that. And again, Pacific Northwest is one of the areas that doesn't get the love that it actually deserves or the recognition when it comes to bass fishing. I think a lot of people think of it as trout and steelhead, but smallmouth fishing, I've heard it's great. So Marvin, before we dive into all that, tell us a little bit about you, how you got into kayak fishing, how you got into being a tournament director over there in that area of the country.
Sure. Well, yeah. Thanks a ton for having me on, Armando. I really appreciate it. I got started fishing as a little kid. I don't even remember catching my first fish. It was before I can remember. But I remember catching my first bass. I was about 9, 10 years old and fishing for bluegill, or in the South, as they call them, brim, and hooked into about a 5-pound bass and just blew my mind. So, I fished my whole life. I kind of stopped fishing a bit as an adult when I got busy. And then I got back into it probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. And I got into kayak fishing around 2015. I picked up a paddle kayak because I was fishing from the shore, and when friends would take me out on their boats or something. So I was looking for a way to get out on the water and explore more. And I just fell in love with it. It, for some people, it's like a stepping stone up to a boat. For me, it's like, no, I'd rather kayak fish. I love being in tune with the water. I love being right on top of the water where I can reach down and touch the water anytime I want to. Fighting a fish that's right in your face. Yeah, I just adore that side of it, being tuned into nature. And instead of feeling like I'm battling against nature to catch a fish, you have to work. In a kayak, you got to work with nature. You got to work with the wind. You got to work with the current. It's not like a boat where you can just crank up the motor and go.
You're preaching to the choir here because I feel
I figured I
exactly the
was.
same, yeah, exactly the same way about it. I was doing a live show with Brandon Mays from that bass fishing dude up in Instagram, and I was mentioning that, it's just that it's not that I don't want to have a boat or can't afford a boat. It's just that kayak fishing brings so much more enjoyment in the fishing part of it, that I just like I can't choose any other vessel to fish other than kayak fish. Um, and it's like all the same reasons that you mentioned. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
that one-on-one with nature, kind of like, and that mano a mano fight, if you will, with the bass, kind of like
Hmm.
gives it more of a level playing field, makes it a little bit more exciting.
It does.
But man, so your first fish was a 5 pounder bass. You know how many years it took me to get a 5 pound bass, and I live in Texas. That's pretty awesome.
I mean, your memory's a little foggy. I asked my dad at that time. My dad was with me. I said, "So how big was it? How big was?" He said, "Oh, it was about 5 pounds." So I'm trusting his judgment on it, his memory of it at the time. Uh, but yeah, it was a big fish. I know that it was the biggest fish I remember ever catching at that age on a
You
on a night crawler too, of all things.
you mentioned your first kayak was a paddle kayak. What kayak was it? Do you remember
It
the
was
brand and model?
yeah, it was a native watercraft Slayer 12. Um, and I'm Native Pro staff to this day. I'm still loyal and dedicated to Native. I love their boats. But yeah, it was a cool kayak. All my friends started calling me Green Machine because it was like this lime green, super bright boat. I wanted to be seen by the boats out on the power boats out on the reservoirs down in Arizona when I picked it up. I was living in Arizona at the time when I got it.
So let me ask you this: from fishing in Arizona, bass fishing, which I'm assuming it's limited, right? I know Arizona doesn't have that much, um, that many lakes and all that.
You'd
That
be
we can
surprised.
really.
Yeah, you'd really be surprised. It's there's some real hammers down there. Like Bryce Gibbs is in the
Oh yeah, I've
Phoenix
heard
area, and
about
I
those.
used to
Yeah.
fish with Bryce a lot. He and I are pretty tight. And I mean, there's some big reservoirs. There's this the Salt River goes down through Arizona, and they made a bunch of reservoirs along it. So there's like this string of big reservoirs, and largemouth especially. There's some huge largemouth. My biggest largemouth there was a 25-inch largemouth, about
Oh, that's not bad at all.
10.5 pounds, something like that.
So you see,
Huge fish.
I was misinformed. I didn't know that bass fishing culture
I,
was that
I
great.
I tend to live in the places that people don't think have good fish.
But
So
compare that to now Pacific Northwest. Sorry.
yeah, it's kind of
How
the
does it
polar
compare? Yeah.
opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah. It, you know, uh, Arizona is probably a little closer to Texas in terms of what it has going for
Yeah.
it. Lots of largemouth. You get up into the mountains, and there's some smallmouth there, but it's pretty hard to find real big smallmouth there. You can; they pop up now and then. Up here, the smallmouth are a lot more dominant in the river systems. And then there are a lot of lakes that have good largemouth too. But the largemouth, because of our climate, it's a little cooler here year round uh, and in the winter. They just don't get quite as big. You can catch, like an 8 or 9 pounder here is sort of a fish of a lifetime. And I've got buddies who've caught 8 or 9 pounders here, but that's a rare fish up here, and it's going to be a really old fish that's been beaten up. It's haggard. They're usually real fat. They're a little shorter, so it might be a 22-inch fish that's 9 pounds, 8 9 pounds, but it's going to be real wide, and it's just going to be beaten up. Whereas the smallmouth, and you can find largemouth in the river systems too, like in the Columbia River, you can find largemouth there too if you look in the right places. And those fish are younger and healthier. There's a lot more food. Fishing current, you're always going to find fish that are a lot tougher, a lot harder fighting fish than lake fish anyway. So yeah, you can find giant smallmouth in the Columbia River, the Snake River, Dworshak Reservoir up in Idaho. There's lots of really good places to find smallmouth, and my biggest up here is about 21 inches, and I know people who've got 22, 23-inch smallmouth, which is, that's a world class smallmouth wherever you catch it. You fish the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, you fish Lake Champlain, and any of these classic smallmouth places, and that's a huge fish anywhere you go.
Yeah, so you're not shouldn't be considered second place when it comes to smallmouth fishing compared to
No,
other places. But for whatever reason, now let me ask you this: how is the bass fishing culture? Because it's one thing to have that plentiful smallmouth bass. The other thing is, like, do people want to fish for it? Because I know, like fly fishing, steelhead, salmon fishing, those are
sure.
big in that area. How's the bass fishing, and how is it progressing?
The community is great. The bass fishing community is strong and very cohesive. But like you alluded to, salmon and steelhead are sort of king up here, and sturgeon and saltwater fishing, of course, is great up here also. So those, for so long, those were such a huge resource for anglers to go after, and for money to be spent, and for people to travel here to fish for. But now the salmon and steelhead are really a dwindling resource. Uh, if it weren't for the hatcheries, the fishery would be gone, I think. The wild fish the true native wild fish are hard to come by. Um, so the hatcheries are kind of keeping it alive. And every year the runs just seem to get worse and worse. We had a pretty good steelhead run this year, winter steelhead run, but the salmon runs have been pretty dismal. Coho's still doing okay in hatchery rivers, but like the wild Chinook salmon, the king salmon, they're smaller and in much smaller numbers than they used to be. So some of those anglers are switching over to warm water species. They're fishing for bass, for walleye, um, because there's pretty good walleye fisheries up here as well. Um, but I don't know. We kind of get looked down upon by the salmon and steelhead anglers as, oh, that's easy to fish for, and of course they haven't done it, but they think, but they're throwing bait. We're throwing artificial lures, and they're throwing bait, so that's a little unfair comparison. But yeah, we're sort of the redheaded stepchild up here. But the community of people who actually fish it love it, and it is, like you said, growing at an exponential rate. In our tournament series here, last year alone, we nearly doubled the numbers of anglers that we have. We have over 200 registered members in our tour series.
It's interesting that you mentioned that one of the reasons you get looked down upon from, compared to steelhead and trout, is because they think it's easier. Like I think it's the complete opposite. Like over here in
I agree.
Texas, when they stock trout, and I love it every year. I haven't done it this year, but I'm planning to do it sometime probably next week. But hit the Brazos River and go for some trout. But to me, it's super easy. Like
Stalker trout.
Yeah,
Stalker trout is super easy.
yeah, it's like fish in a barrel. I mean,
Yeah,
I'll get a five limit in an hour. Like most of the time,
totally.
I was just like, I'll just let go of the little ones because obviously they're gonna die. So it's really, if you fish it, keep it, because the thing is gonna die. It's not gonna survive summer. Only in the
Sure.
Guadalupe River are they gonna survive. So it's like super easy to fish for this. Why would you think La Bass is more like you got to figure it out? I don't know. Just to me, maybe it's out of ignorance because my limited knowledge in fishing for trout. But I just figure it's super easy to fish for trout.
Yeah, I think they just haven't experienced it. I mean, I think catching a 12-inch bass, it's not very hard. You know, if you're throwing something decent and there are small bass around, they're pretty easy to catch. But those people that say it's easy, I'm like, well, how many 22-inch bass have you
Yeah.
caught? Because that's a different animal. I mean, that's a fish that has beaten the odds and survived. Uh, you know, 10 million to 1 chance of getting that big and that old. And when a fish gets that big and that old, it ain't dumb. It didn't
Yeah.
get there by being stupid and being easy to catch, or it'd be gone. So yeah, and I think it's the same thing like you're saying with stocker trout are easy. They've grown up in a fish tank their whole
Yeah.
life, eating food that's been fed to them, so they'll eat anything you throw at them. But if you go out and catch a wild trout, that takes some skill. I do a lot of trout fishing and I do steelhead fishing and all those things. Um, it's all relative. It just depends on your experience and what you're going after. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of people get attracted with bass fishing is because it's so hard to catch.
Oh yeah.
Compared, like we're talking about tournaments, when you need to get, consistently in the top teens or the low 20s to actually have a chance to catch a check. Those are extremely hard to catch compared to other things. Plus, there's a lot more technique involved versus just throwing chicken liver and a bobber and just waiting for
Sure,
something to hit.
catfishing. Yep.
Yeah. Nothing wrong against catfishing.
No, it's great.
But
It's
it's great.
super.
But it's just I think a lot of people just like myself are, just what is that word? Masochist? Is that the word I'm looking for? Where you want to like the hardest road
That's right.
to
That's
accomplish
right.
your goal. That's what you're going after.
What's the bait that they're unlikely to bite? That's what I want to throw.
And what's more expensive?
Well, that too. Yeah.
But yeah, we can go down that rabbit hole on that a lot. But I wanted to also talk about the Pacific Northwest as, from the climate standpoint. Like I've always thought it would be cold, harsh winters. Now I had a friend, a coworker from Texas that moved to Seattle. She was originally from Seattle, got relocated due to furlough, and then retired and moved back to Seattle. So I got a chance to learn a lot about Seattle. And I found out that it's actually winters in Seattle, she was telling me, are warmer than typical winters in Texas. And that blew my mind. I'm like, that cannot be true. Now, I've learned a lot about it. Well, my limited Google and YouTube research, right? That a lot of it has to do with the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific winds, kind of warm Pacific winds just coming up and getting trapped in kind of like a micro climate, within the mountains and the wind pushing up. What is your experience moving from Arizona to the Pacific Northwest when it comes to weather?
I couldn't be much different, I would say. But yeah, you're absolutely right with what you were saying. We are kind of a microclimate here. We're a rainforest. I live pretty close to Portland. I'm about uh, 45 minutes away from Portland. And we're in the middle of a rainforest here. It's big, old growth, Doug fir trees and stuff. And so the Cascade Mountain Range, the weather comes off the ocean and bumps into that mountain range and really can't just pass over it. So we get rain that hangs out here. And the winter is our rainy season. That's when it's really wet from November to March, really, is our rainy season. Although this has been an especially mild winter. We got a lot of rain early in the winter, but it's been pretty dry. It's bluebird skies out there right now, and it's probably I don't know, it's probably about 45 today. Um, we've had kind of a cold snap the last few days where it got down to 20, but that's kind of unusual. It's usually in the 30s to 50s throughout most of the winter. And when it rains, it's a little warmer than when it's sunny, because that kind of traps the warmth in. Um, but yeah, and our summers, everybody thinks of it as being rainy up here, and it is, but the summers are not rainy at all. In fact, we had very little rain last summer, and it was a pretty hot summer. We had a number of days that got up to about 100 degrees. So it's we get all types of weather here, from snow to heat to rain to snow. Just depends on if you wait long enough.
Yeah. So what is like the best season to go for bass fishing in your area?
It really starts to take off around May. Uh, you know, our tournament season here starts in March. It starts in just a few days, but it's pretty slow. March is pretty slow. By the end of March, people will start catching some fish. And I know people who've been fishing all winter, and you can catch fish, especially smallmouth. They don't mind colder weather, so they're still pretty active if you can find them. The largemouth are a little slow and lethargic this time of year, but I've caught them in January, so it's doable. Um, but around the end of April, beginning of May, it starts to really take off. That's the pre-spawn is all through April, really. So the spawn starts around end of April, early May, and April, May, June is just gangbusters. And the whole summer's really good. And it's not so hot. Usually it's not so hot that you can't fish all summer, which was the thing in Arizona. Like middle
Yeah.
of summer, even if you go out at dawn and just fish a few hours, by the time you get off the water, it's 105 to 110 degrees. It's brutal. And up here, you can fish all day long in the summer, and it's not really a problem. Uh, and then the fall is great too, and the fall kind of stretches pretty long, well into October, where the fishing's still great all the way through October.
Do you, and I'm assuming not based on what we talked about a little bit about the culture of bass fishing and it's just barely growing, but what is the thought on bed fishing? Like I know some states in the Northeast they don't allow bed fishing, doing the spawning just to keep the healthy. How is it over there in Oregon? Is it frowned upon? Is it illegal? Is it?
Now you're touching on a sensitive subject up here for us
Oh,
bass
really?
anglers. It's the problem is, like I said, because the salmon and steelhead side of things has been so strong for so long here. That also means a lot of the fish and game departments are heavily powered by the salmon and steelhead side of things. And so I talked to the warm water bios at the Fish and Game in Washington and Oregon and Idaho, all three. I talk to them regularly because, I have to work with them for doing our tournaments and everything. And I told you how great the Columbia River is. There's no limit on bass in the Columbia. They don't care if you catch them all and kill them all. They could care less. There's a river in Oregon, the Coquille River, which used to have a lot of salmon in it. The salmon runs have gone away, and now it's the smallmouth have done really well there. And a lot of the salmon people will feel like, oh, well, it's the smallmouth's fault that the salmon runs are gone. I'm like, no. If you if you took the smallmouth away, it's not like the salmon are going to come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
They're not gonna. Well, in that river, they actually have allowed spear fishing for smallmouth.
I've read that. I actually read that.
There's so many places in, especially Washington and Oregon, where it's just like no limit, do whatever you want. And I'm like, you guys don't understand the resource that you have and the world-class fishery that you have for smallmouth in the Columbia. People travel to these smallmouth destinations all over the country. I mean, my uncle lives in Pennsylvania, so I go and fish the Susquehanna and the Juniata rivers in Pennsylvania with him a lot, and it's a fantastic fishery. And like you said, in the spawn, they shut those rivers down. You can't even target smallmouth during the spawn because they recognize what a resource it is for the community and all the people that are going to come in and chase those fish. So they really protect it. They haven't figured that out up here yet. The warm water bios have. When I talk to them, they're like, yeah, we really want to do this, but they just don't have the clout. They don't have the power in the organizations yet to make that happen. So, me and some of my friends, some of the organizations that my tour series is affiliated with, we're trying to make changes, inroads to that end, but it's a challenge. So I would fish. I don't personally don't like to fish beds, even if I'm in a tournament. If I have to, and I'm in a tournament and I want to win, of course I'll do it. But it's not my favorite type of fishing. It feels like fishing by intimidation.
Yeah.
You're just like pissing the fish off so much that it finally will bite. And it was pretty common in Arizona when the spawn came. People were out there trying to catch bedfish and catching giants in the spring. I haven't noticed that as much up here. There certainly is an opportunity for it. I don't know what it is. I don't see fish on beds as much up here because of I think because of the nature of the bodies of water. It's a little more challenging to find them. The water in some cases isn't as clear. The water here is usually stained a bit, so it's a little harder to bed fish, especially a smallmouth. They're going to bed 15 feet down. So if stained water 15 feet down,
Yeah.
you're not going to see them. I mean, I used to fish Lake Havasu, and you can see 30 feet down in that lake. So it's pretty easy to see them on beds. But yeah, I haven't noticed it being an issue up here where people are fishing beds a lot, but there's certainly no restriction on it. They can do it as much as they want.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, especially like smallmouth, how they bed fish so deep, even on stained water. Like over here, I've noticed, especially on Lake Fork, um, because the water is stained, especially on up in those creeks, they'll bed fish where you can see the tail. Just you can see the tail, just like you know, airing out the eggs. So you'll see them. You can spot them just by looking at. You see that tail just kind of peeking out of the surface.
Coming out of the water. Yeah.
Yeah, coming out of the water, so it makes it easier. While um, clear bodies of water like Wheeler Branch Reservoir, they'll be bed fishing about 5, sometimes 10 feet. I'm sorry, depending on the water clarity,
Sure.
which you can see them. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I'm not very knowledgeable on the um, biology side of smallmouth fishing. I wouldn't even know when smallmouth bass, yeah, um, actually spawn here in Texas. I need to get more in touch with that. But then again, I don't really target smallmouth bass here because that's not going to win your tournament in most cases. But it is a great fish, nevertheless. It is a beautiful fish that gives you a great fight. And if you happen to catch one that's big enough for Texas size, compared, because they don't grow that big, it is an exciting fight to have.
I love them. I mean, I don't think there's an angrier fish out there. They're just mean and angry. I love them for their attitude.
Yeah.
I mean, they're beautiful fish too, of course, and like you say, great fighters. But it's their attitude that I just love about them. They're cantankerous.
Yeah, they are definitely. But now you mentioned that you run tournaments. I kind of wanted to talk about, your role in promoting the bass fishing.
Sure.
What's the organization that you associated with, and what exactly do you do as far as growing it?
Yeah, so I was involved with some tournament stuff in Arizona a little bit, and then when I moved out here, I was like, "Oh, great! Now I'm just going to fish. I'm just going to have fun and fish a lot." So, a guy Aaron Roberts, good buddy of mine, had started this kayak fishing tournament series here for bass called Oregon Kayak Bass Fishing, and I joined it and I fished with him in 2018, and I did pretty well. I placed in a handful of the tournaments and caught a lot of fish. And then Aaron had some personal stuff with life and work that was coming up. And so near the end of the season, he asked me, he said, would you consider taking this over for me? And I'm like, yeah, maybe. So we talked about it. And that's when he was starting to get going with Idaho and Washington as well. So I helped him kind of construct this structure for how it works. And so we've got Kayak Fishing Northwest, which is a hat I'm wearing, KFNW. That is sort of the governing body for all the tournaments that we run in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So each of those is a separate division within this parent organization. And so we run 15 tour events between the 3 states, and we don't overlap any of them. So if you wanted to travel around and fish all 3 states, you certainly can do it. And then we do a championship between the 3 states that rotates between the 3 states every year. So it's in Washington this year, it'll be in Oregon next year, and then it'll be in Idaho the year after that. So we just kind of do a round robin deal. We do a bunch of online tournaments. We do a number of opens. We've got a couple of big sponsor opens. We're doing one for NRS this year up at Dvorak Reservoir in Idaho. They're a big sponsor of ours. And we're doing one for Native Watercraft. You probably have heard a little bit about that. The No Limit Big Bass Power Hour. Vinny Ferrari down in the Carolinas did one last December as sort of a test run, and we're doing 5 of them this year in different parts of the country. So I'm running the one up here at Potholes Reservoir. but like you were saying, a lot of my motivation for it is to build community and
Mhm.
build support for bass fishing, kayak bass fishing, and bass fishing in general, both. That's sort of what I get out of it. I'm not super competitive. I've never been a really heavy competitive fisherman, but I love that's one thing I love about the kayak tournament um, community is it's a little bit more friendly. It's a little
Yep.
bit more camaraderie. It's a little bit more sharing. It's not quite as cutthroat. It's not quite as me against you. And I like that aspect of it. That's kind of what fills me with joy when I get involved with it, and all the anglers that we support and help, and all the sponsors that come along and help us. It's I like those aspects of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the big reasons on it, not to stray away too much from the main subject, but it's like when nobody's here in the kayak fishing community or tournament expected to make a living out of just winnings versus bass boat world where you actually need to
Sure,
perform. There's
sure.
money involved. You need to feed your family. I don't want to say the money's a root for evil because I don't believe that it's the obsession with getting more money that's the root for evils. But going back to it, it's like we're in the kayak fishing community don't have to worry about. Well, I need to catch a check in order to make a living. We're all just here to having fun. So we'll see once it gets to that level when and if
It's
it does how it's going to affect. But at the moment, we have to enjoy what we have, and I think
Yeah, yeah,
that
absolutely. If you're going to try and make a living in kayak tournament kayak fishing, you got to wear a lot of hats. You got to,
yeah,
the Christine Fishers and people that,
yeah,
she's got to do a lot of stuff. It's not You're not going to make it just on tournament winnings
yeah,
because it's not enough. Although the tournament winnings are going way up. I mean, you
yeah,
look at the Hobie BOS series and $100,000 for their tournament champions this year. I mean, it's pretty impressive. We gave out over $45,000 last year up
wow.
here in cash and payouts, and over $25,000 in gear. So we're no slouch either, but that's our whole gear. And Hobie BOS is doing it. It's
Then
doubling that in one
only
tournament.
3 days. Yeah, in
Yeah,
3 days.
well, yeah, 3 days, but one tournament. Yep.
And I wanted to touch on something because I know most of my listeners kind of understand this, and maybe one or two that are just getting into kayak fishing. But growing the sport actually helps in the conservation of it. Well, people
Totally.
don't think about this. People think where you're fishing, you're kind of like destroying hampering the growth of this fish. Not really. But
No.
when you think about it, when you do kayak fishing Pacific Northwest, right? The culture over there is like, quote unquote, this is a pest. And the more we get rid of this pest, the better the ecological system for steelhead or salmon it's going to grow.
Yep.
You bring a community that all of a sudden is invested in bass fishing and it creates that mentality. No, we need to save this fish in order for this to grow and bring in tourism, bring in money, not just for the tournament, but for the local
For the
economy and
community.
the
Yeah.
community.
Hmm.
So that's one thing that's important that a lot of people don't realize. The fact that there's so many tournaments, both in kayak and boat fishing, dedicated to bass fishing, especially in areas where they weren't like 5, 10 years ago, is actually helping the health of this fish and the growth of this fish because it creates now an environment where the state or community says we need to conserve this in order to get people to come here and visit us and enjoy the resources. So that I think a lot of people don't get that, and I didn't get that at the beginning. Now that I'm more invested on it, doing the podcast and actually fishing on tournaments, I see that, and that is very important.
I couldn't say it much better than that. You
Yeah,
you summed it up really well there. But yeah, it's you know, especially tournament kayak bass fishing, it's all catch and release. It's all catch
yeah,
photo release. And like I said, I talked to these bios with the fish and game departments, and I mean they're just amazed. They're like, "This is fantastic. You guys are doing catch photo release." I send them our a link to our leaderboard on Tourney X, and they can go in there and their bios can look at every single fish we caught and see
yeah,
what the health of the fish is, how big they are, how long and how heavy they are. They're like, we don't get this from anybody else. This
yeah.
is fantastic. Um, But yeah, we're all about trying to protect our resource, and that's the tough thing with the salmon steelhead world. They want it so that they can take it home.
Yeah.
They're going to keep those fish. If they catch a fish that's legal, uh, they're going to take it. And
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a less sustainable model than ours is, I think, where we're just taking the fish out of the water to say hello and take a picture and then send it back to its. Especially if it's bedding season. I mean, right back on the bed just a
Yeah.
few seconds later.
Yeah, and that's one of the things talking about boat tournaments, MLF, that I appreciate about the MLF. Just kind of watching the videos
Hmm.
and TV on Lake Fork. It's kind of that time where they're starting to the beginning of spawning season. So for them to just say, we just waited here, take buckets of it, put it back in the water. I think it's great. Nothing against Bassmaster.
Sure.
There's a lot more market. It is a lot more marketable when you bring everybody to the big
Yeah.
stage and
Yeah.
they hold up the fish
The
and all that.
awards is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, then again, it it doesn't help the health of the fish when you take them out of that lake, and then especially in bedding season. But that's
I
something
think
for a
you're
whole
right.
nother day. Yeah,
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you talk about MLF, and that's MLF is made for an audience, right?
yeah,
That's what that format is really good for, is for people to watch it. I think we'll eventually get there with kayak fishing. People
yeah.
have talked about it and tried to do it. We don't quite have the cell service or the Wi-Fi to do it at this point, but at some point you're going to have a couple of cameras on every kayak, and you're going to be able to watch these people catching fish.
I think once the technology becomes affordable,
Yeah,
because they're probably. I mean, when you think about when I mean, you and I, Mike, Marvin, we're pretty much kind of. I'm assuming kind of like we're not gonna say what's your age or my age, no, but we're kind of around that same age.
23. I'm
Yeah,
23.
yeah, I'm 25. So back when we were 5 years old and we used to have our own handheld cameras, what that thing that you put on your shoulder
Oh
weighed
yeah,
about 20 pounds.
holy, the
And
cell
one,
phone, the brick
yeah,
cell phone.
yeah, and now you have a little GoPro that's 4 inch, that's
It's
less,
crazy.
like 2 inches wide and 2 inches in length. And so eventually, I think the technology is going to be there. Once it's there, I think it's really. I mean, when you think about the growth of the kayak fishing community in the last few years, especially in the pandemic, like that's one of the. I think probably the only sport that really grew in the pandemic, because now people it's like, well, we're more limited, what we can do. So let's buy a kayak and go out in the water and have fun. So
Absolutely.
that grew even in the middle of the pandemic. But talking about the growth of it, what is as as you worked as a tournament director and work with growing the sport of smallmouth or bass fishing, I should say, in the Pacific Northwest, how have you seen it grow from when you started to where it is now? Like, how many are you averaging versus then and now, as far as anglers?
Yeah, so I started, like I said, I fished the tournaments in 2018. I started running them in 2019. And, our numbers in 2019 were small. I mean, we'd have a dozen people fish some events. Was about all we would get for certain events. Other ones were a little bigger, depending on where we're fishing and the date. But um, and now last year, we had probably half of our events were over 40 or 50 anglers.
It's not bad.
Our first event this year, first time we've ever done this, is we're taking uh, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and we're combining them for one event for our first tour event of the year, where all three divisions have to compete. And if they want to, and it's on the Columbia River, sort of in the middle of where most of us are. So it's not a terrible trek to get there. But we're going to have easily over 100 people at that event. So that'll be pretty epic. That'll be a big event. So yeah, the numbers, like you said, kayak fishing in general is growing, and it blossomed during the pandemic because people didn't have many choices. Um, but I don't think that's a bowl. I think they're going to stay with it, at least most of them. Um, the thing that really made a difference for us, besides just the natural growth arc that we're seeing, is we started raising money to increase our payouts with sponsor money instead of just paying people out their entry fees. We're actually boosting that with sponsor money so that the payouts are big. We had, first place in most of our events last year was $1,000, and this year it's going to be more like probably $1,800. I would say is going to be an average
Really?
first place take in our
With
events.
with about 40 tournament
With
anglers?
about 50 people, I think
Wow,
first place is going to be $1,500 to $1,800 probably,
that's not bad at all.
with sponsor money. No, it's good.
What's the entry fee?
$50.
That's not bad at all.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
let me ask you this, because that's interest. That's a business model a lot of people should follow.
Uh huh.
Because we don't see. I mean, in order for me to see a $1,800 payout in first place, um,
You need a
we need
100
about
people, right?
more than 100 people.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, how have you developed that business model on a market where it's not as smaller than on the average smaller than most states that do bass fishing? How do you get the sponsor money? What have you done that? What have you figured out that other states haven't figured out? I guess that's my question.
I think that's one reason Aaron asked me to step in and help. Why he chose me to do that, even though I was kind of new to the state, is probably a little bit of my business background. I'm a small business owner. I do graphic design, web design, and brand strategy, and I've done that for on my own for over 20 years, and my entire career. That's really what I've worked in. So that helps. That really comes in handy. And I'm used to working with clients. I'm used to dealing with clients and working together with them. And so it's not that different for me to go out and try to sell the idea that we're going to promote you. We're going to give you ROI, return on your investment, so that if you donate whatever amount it is, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, if you donate that amount to us, we're going to make sure that we bring that business back to you, and you're going to make money on that investment that you made in us. And we've been really successful at building on that. It's not something you can do overnight.
Mhm.
First year I started out just going for in-kind donations, just gear sponsorship, and that's a lot easier for people starting out in the tournament world. That's where I would focus your energy to begin with, is just try and get people to donate gear and give away the gear. But when you do that, you got to do it right. Like, you got to have good photos of giving the gear to the person. You got to promote it on social media. You got to promote it on your website. You have to do all that, because that's how you're paying for that gear, is by giving them some kind of value for it. And if you don't, then they won't come back to you. But they have for us, and then we're able to leverage that one year and say, look, this is what we did for you. Now let's take it up a notch, and another notch, and another notch. Um, and so we've got sponsors that are willing to spend some money on us to help us grow, and it's worked. We definitely have grown. Like you said, our payouts are a little higher than most for the number of anglers that we have, and we're super grateful to our sponsors for letting us do that.
That's awesome. If I may ask, what sponsors do you have?
So this
Or
year, our big sponsors, number one is Next Adventure, which is they're an outfitter in Portland. They do all kinds of. They're basically like a local REI type business. They do all kinds of camping and hiking gear and everything. But they've got two of their locations are just paddle sports. Is all they're focused on, is all kayaks and canoes and stand up paddle boards and all that. So they have been a long time sponsor of us, even before I was here. And we've developed a fantastic relationship with them, to the point where when they're looking to hire somebody, they reach out to us and say, we want to bring somebody in from your organization who knows bass fishing, who is an avid kayak angler. We want them to work in our shop because they're going to be able to sell this. They give us discounts so we can send our members to them. And our members specifically get a special discount from them on boats or accessories or anything they need. It's it's a fantastic relationship that we've developed with that dealer. Um, And then our other big sponsors this year are going to be Jackson Kayak is one of our big sponsors this year. That's the first time working with them. Richard Penny, who some people might remember from KBF days, he's their sales rep in this area and works their pro team as well. So he was instrumental in helping us land that deal this year. And then NRS, who've been, again, longtime sponsor of ours. I have a great relationship with them. They're just a fantastic company. We all use their gear, right? Everybody uses some kind of NRS gear, whether it's the Chinook PFD or Boundary boots or something. Everybody uses them. So those are our three biggies this year. We usually have 3 to 5 big sponsors, and then we have a lot of smaller sponsors that are donating gear for us to give away. And
that's awesome. Congratulations to what you've done there. I think
thanks.
that's amazing. You deserve a lot of props for that. Now, let me ask you this. Me and Shane on our host chat, we always, Shane from Bass Thumps Fishing from California, we're always debating on why major trails like Bassmasters, Kayak Series now, and Hobie BOS not investing, in California. My thought is like, well,
Go west.
You have a national trail and then only 40, 55 local anglers are showing up. It's not worth their investing the resources. Now, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I've seen any of those national trails go all the way to the Pacific Northwest. Would you like to see them, and do you think the local talent would support them?
They have touched on it, I will say. Before we dive too far into that, shout out to Utah, our sister state, who I'm good friends with Erin Mathis, who runs Kayak Fishing Utah. She does a fantastic job. And those anglers have been killing it. Cody Henley, winning the 10. And then they just did this big Yakabass tournament down in Northern California, and that was another Utah guy who won it, Chris Spence.
Yep.
All those folks are doing a fantastic job and bringing a lot of attention to us here in the West. Bryce Gibbs, that I mentioned earlier in Arizona, too, bringing a lot of attention to the West. KBF did some events up here. They did some trail events early on. We did one in Oregon right before I moved here. And we tried to do another one on the Columbia, but I don't know, the numbers didn't work out on that one. Hobie BS did do one. They did one on the Delta in California. They didn't get the numbers that they wanted, which, shame on the anglers here. But at the same time, we had one shot and that's it. You didn't get the numbers, you're out. So that was a little tough, but I hope that they'll come back. Bassmaster's taken a different approach with trying to do the local regional clubs, and they had some challenges with that they're working through, and I think they've gotten some of that figured out. I think they'll be up here eventually, and that's one of the reasons we're doing what we do. That gets into the whole conversation of the West Coast Championship, which we haven't talked about at all. And that's an event that I help run with James Snyder from Yakabass NorCal and Mark Chrisman from SoCal Kayak Anglers. So the three of us run the West Coast Championship, really. And the West Coast Championship is like 7 different kayak clubs, all in Western states: Arizona, Utah, my 3, California, Colorado now. And it's just a loose DIY kind of alliance. It's a very organic thing. It's not a big organization. And so they qualify anglers in their regular events all season long, or at least the first part of the season. And then those qualified anglers can go to Clear Lake and fish Clear Lake on the championship, August 18 and 19, 19 and 20, 19 and 20. And that was super successful last year. We had 104 anglers show up and fish. Mike Lavoie won it, and he won over 10 grand. And, he had big bass both days, and he had side pots. And when you count all that stuff up, he had over 10 grand. So that, I think that, and the NRS Open and the native Big Bass Power Hour, those events are all going to get big numbers. there's just too much money in them, too much opportunity to win, that they're going to attract anglers. And I think that will draw the attention of some of the bigger national trails, and they'll give us a second look probably. I get it. I mean, they got to hit their numbers, or it's not worth it for them to do it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and like I said, we debate that a lot. And one of the things is, if what I always say, if Hobie BOS is going to a sponsorship and say, hey, we're selling out like they are this year, we're selling out all our events, they can say, well, we want this from you. Like, this is the money that we expect from you. Versus going, well, we didn't average a sellout, mainly because you went to California and you averaged 50. So that's 75% less than you would on
hard to justify, right?
It's one of the things where, like, well, now you're losing money. Even I always say Hobie BOS is not interested in making money per se out of the tournament versus what Bassmaster does. Bassmaster, their job is to host tournaments and make money.
That's right.
Hobie, their job is to make kayaks.
It's to sell watercraft. Yeah.
Now having the brand extend to tournament is bringing, attention to their products, which again, to me, my opinion is Hobie saying, as long as I'm not losing money by hosting tournaments, AJ, you can do whatever you want. Just don't make sure we're not losing money.
We break even, we're making money, right?
Yeah, we're breaking even, making money, because now you're paying for this amazing promotion that you don't have to pay by commercials or any other thing, because
institutional branding. What's the value of that institutional branding of Hobie being a household word? I mean, that's worth a lot of money.
It's funny because we look into, I've done home inspections, right? And one of the things in home inspections that we do is you don't refer to drywall as sheetrock, because that's a product name.
Yeah,
we have the tendency, and the Hobie, I don't think anybody's gonna just adopt the word Hobie to substitute it for a kayak. But it's getting to that point where you get that brand name that it
fishing kayak,
product,
I mean, when people think of a fishing kayak, you're right. To a degree, that happens. They're like, "Oh, I've seen those Hobies." And referring to a fishing kayak. Yeah,
and you can't put any money on that, But I mean, it's growing. I understand the other side of it. Like, if I'm in California and I only get one shot at a Hobie or Bassmaster, well, guess what? I'm not going to be able to qualify for an Angler of the Year. So why am I paying $250 for a tournament that I'm only going to do once a year, where I can just pay $50 for a tournament?
Excellent point.
I understand both sides, and I like the fact that Bassmaster is doing its thing, where they has just the national trail, not the national trail, the state chapter, and Hobie BOS is doing something with American Bass Association, where they're kind of like sponsoring, so they're paying pretty much to have their name on the trail. And I think that's what's going to happen.
Yep.
Eventually.
The other aspect of it that I think people don't quite understand sometimes, you probably have a better sense of it being in Texas, but I grew up on the East Coast, so I get it. People don't quite understand the scale of the West compared to the East. For me to drive from where I am to fish one of our tournaments in the Boise area is a 9-10 hour drive. I used to live in North Carolina. Well, I could drive from North Carolina to New Jersey in 8 hours. That's a big chunk of the eastern coast, right? Like, I've gone a long way. Or I could drive down to Florida in the same amount of time. Here, if I want to drive down to Southern California, I mean, that's 13 hours, 14 hours. If I want to drive to Lake Havasu, that's more like 18 hours. So it's tough. It's very tough to compete geographically out here. We're just much more spread out, and there's just a lot more empty space. There's a lot of land that there aren't any people. The density of people on the East Coast is much tighter. And Texas is sort of in between the two, right?
Yeah, and I think, and that's funny because I tell my friends, when we're going to tournaments, if I leave on Dallas, which is considered Central Texas, which is not, it's really more East Texas. A lot of the West is just kind of like just not dead land, but just land that's vacant land.
It's like New Mexico and Oklahoma,
So it's 4 hours to get to the eastern border, I drive to Georgia. It's closer for me. And again, keep in mind, I live 4 hours from the eastern border. If I drive to Georgia, it's still shorter than driving beeline it all the way to the west side border of Texas.
You're in a
So
big
that's how
state.
big
You're in a very big state. Yeah.
I'll drive 4 hours across 2 or 3 states before I get to the others to west side of Texas.
Sure.
That's how big it is. So yeah, and even adding to that, when you're talking about California, the West Coast, you have to go through the Rocky Mountains, which is a lot more in gas prices. Having to go
Indeed.
through that,
Especially nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah. So I get why I understand, and I think that's why people have to think about it differently. We have to think about the West Coast as being its own region and growing it as its own region and having its own thing and making it them profitable where they can make, kind of like the same winnings they would make on a national trail. I think that's the way we need to rethink it and reapproach it. That's just my personal opinion. But again,
it's hard to ask
yeah.
people to travel, and they do it. Cody Henley just did it. Obviously, went down to Florida to compete from Utah. That's a haul. It's hard to ask people, again, when our payouts are not so great that you can make a career out of this.
Yeah,
it's hard to ask them to do that multiple times in a season, to travel back and fish in Alabama. I was born right near Lake Gunnersville. I was born in Huntsville, Alabama, so I know that area. I have a lot of family still down there. But yeah, for me to travel down there and fish, or Florida or Tennessee, that's a lot. That's a big giant trip for me. That's 3 days in a car.
Definitely, time away from family plus Airbnb's bills and all that, gas prices. Well, Marvin, I've had you for almost an hour, and I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, talk about the Pacific Northwest, bass fishing, smallmouth fishing. And first of all, I wish you the best moving forward as far as growing the sport over there. Anything we can do to help out, Paddle and Fin, obviously we're more than happy to help to grow the sport everywhere. I wanted to give you a few minutes to thank everybody you want to thank. Like you mentioned, you have some sponsors that have helped you. If you want to take time to thank individuals or companies, please take your time to do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mentioned some of our big sponsors. We've got a handful of other sponsors that have been great, have been with us a long time. I don't want to go through that whole list because I'll miss somebody, and I hate to do it, but there's some fantastic ones in there, and you can get them all on our website, kayakfishingnorthwest.com. My other tournament directors, that's one of the neat things we have. By running 3 divisions, I've got Jim Davis, who's my tournament director in Washington, and Chris Bordas, who's my tournament director in Idaho. And between the 3 of us, we always have people to judge events and make sure that we're covered that way. We all compete still in our tournament series, so we don't judge ourselves like that. That's a no-no. So it's always nice to have those other people to do it. And we have a bunch of assistants. Kagan Pankratz and Matthew Burdick help me here in Oregon. Patrick Kelly in Washington. We've got people that help us with photos and help us run events. They've all been just fantastic. The same thing we were talking about earlier. We've got such a great community of people, and it really shows when we do events, because whenever we need help, we have it. Who else? Is there anybody else I should thank?
Your wife. I always tell people, thank your wife.
Yeah, my girlfriend Chelsea. She's yep. She's very gracious. We both work from home here. She's got an office out back, and I've got an office here in the house. So, but yeah, I spend a lot of time away from home in the summer. So, good on her for allowing me to do that.
Definitely. Marvin, where can people either follow you or on social media, or if you prefer them to follow, I don't know if your the trails that you direct have a social media account, but regardless, where would people follow Marvin Forte or the tournament or the trails that are in the Pacific Northwest?
The nice thing about having a somewhat unique name, as you yourself have a somewhat unique name as well, is if you just search Marvin Forte, you'll find me. There's not very many other Marvin Fortes in the world. There are a few. My dad's not with us anymore. He was a Marvin Forte, but But there are a few out there. But if you do a search for Marvin Forte or for Kayak Fishing Northwest, you will find everything there is to find about both the organization and about me.
No problem.
Simple.
Well, thank you again, Marvin, for taking the time to join us and talk about the great fisheries that you have up there and the wonderful job that you are doing. Again, we wish you the best moving forward. You know, it's great to see the bass fishing and kayak fishing community grow in everywhere.
Yeah.
And we hope that it grows enough where we can see more national trails come up to that area of the country and give us an excuse to go out there and go fishing. So thank you again, Marvin.
Thanks for having me. I hope you can come up here and fish in the Northwest. You said it's on your bucket list, so come on up. We'll get you on some fish.
No problem. Oh, I have to ask you, what beer are you drinking? I noticed you.
Oh yeah. I had to go local, so
yeah, definitely.
I've got a Rogue Dead Guy Ale, which is
like the
Rogue River is one of the classic wild rivers in the country and in the West. Just a fantastic, beautiful river down in Southern Oregon. And Rogue Brewery named themselves after that river. And this is a great beer. They do some unique packaging, if you notice that.
Yeah, no, they spend a lot on the.
Well, there's like 5 of the cans in there will be like this, and then one will have the full. It's got a dead guy. It's got like a skeleton. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Well, as long as it tastes great, I don't care what the label says.
Indeed.
All right. Well,
thanks so much, Armando.
My pleasure. For those out there listening, thank you again for tuning in. If you made it this far, go check out the sponsor. Go to Douglas Outdoors, douglasoutdoors.com. Check out the full line of LRS, X Matrix, and fly fishing rods. If you're going to be out on the water, you're going to have a few beers. Please drink responsibly, wear your PFDs, and stay safe, everyone. Peace.